everybody. My name is Daniel, and I'm here with Michelle, and we have a special guest today on our Latinx Learners. We're so excited that you joined us here for another episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the state of Latinos. We have a friend, a colleague, and an expert who is a scholar in his own right that will be giving his responses to a lot of topics Michelle and I have been talking about, texting about, and tweeting about. So thank you all so much for joining us. Michelle, how are things going in your world?
Everything is good. I have a funny story though. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you. Good to be together again. We're recording this in the evening. We won't tell you what time because we don't want to give away too much. But we're recording this in the evening, and I go in the restroom and I'm fixing my hair, and my son comes in, and he's 8, and he goes, "Where are you going?" I mean, son, we're in a pandemic. I don't go anywhere. I said, "I'm going to record Latinx Learners," and he said, "On the computer?" Super suspicious, right? And I said, "Yes, mijo, on the computer. I'm going to record on the computer." "What time?" 7:15. So he walks out, he comes back in. I thought, okay, he's just, keeping track of me. I don't go further than 12 steps away from these kids, right? I'm with them all day long. He comes back and he goes, "That's in 13 minutes. And he stays in the bathroom and watches me finishing getting ready. They are like little koalas at this point. They just don't want me to go anywhere, and there's no chance of that. But I thought it was pretty funny that he was, like a dad. Where are you going? With who? And where? And why?
And what time will you be home? ¿Para dónde vas?
Yeah, I know, exactly.
I have an interesting story. I was supposed to pick up Diego today as a reward because, I work from home now. So as a reward, I was going to pick him up and he was going to be a car rider. I've done it for, the last couple of weeks while I'm home, and I was working on something and I got an angry email from a student. So I was working on a reply and I was, going to town, looking up things. And then I get a text message from Anna that said, "Hey, are you here?" Leaving the house now. So I get there and he's like in tears with his pickle mask because he's got a pickle mask on. I just see these tears. I'm like, "Oh, mijo de mi vida, I'm so sorry. You made me late." Get in the car. Come on, let's go. So
I'm sorry.
Stories.
We don't actually let you cry that long. Sorry, you're a Latino kid. Get over it.
Quick.
Well, Daniel, let me introduce Felipe Hinojosa in a different way, and I'm doing this because of our commonality, something that he and I share in common. So before I get into his formal bio, everyone, which is so impressive, by the time we're finished with this, you will also have a scholarly crush on Felipe like we do. But Felipe, before I tell them who you are as a professional, I wanted you to tell us a story from your childhood or your background that captures who you are as a Latino.
Oh, that's a great question. I grew up in Brownsville, Texas, which is what we share in common. And I grew up in a neighborhood. I grew up in two distinct neighborhoods, but from the time that I was up until 6th grade, I grew up in a neighborhood that was called La 421. And it was a neighborhood that was about, this? You know La 421?
My dad is from there.
Okay. That's where I lived. And that's where, my family, my parents have, they recently sold the house because they couldn't live alone. Really? But this is a great neighborhood. And your dad, would certainly know. It's just a phenomenal neighborhood because there were so many different, there was a small tortilleria. All of the homes around there sold, tenían tienditas. Each of the houses had tienditas where they would sell hielitos. They put Kool-Aid in a styrofoam cup, freeze it, and we'd pay $0.25 for a hielito. And my grandfather lived on Ringgold Street. We would just walk right over to Ringgold Street and visit. And anytime we wanted candy, which was often, we'd go to the end of Ringgold Street and we'd yell to the little store owner, whose name was Ophelia, and me and my primas would stand outside and we'd yell, "Ophelia," because she wouldn't be at the store all the time. She'd just come out of the house. And we had to yell really loud because she had the TV on really loud and you could hear the TV. So we would yell and Ophelia would come out and, we'd buy candy and all that. But that was, there were, preachers on bikes. There were cholos and cholas everywhere. It was a vibrant place to grow up. And I grew up in a home of 5 sisters and 1 brother. I'm the youngest.
Mhm.
And on one side, Conchita had her lawn so beautifully manicured. The
Uh-huh.
roses, the flowers, everything she had was so beautiful. And on the other hand, on the other side was a family that every weekend barbecued. We didn't drink beer. My parents didn't drink beer or anything, but this family did. And I grew up, just imagining one day being able to drink Miller Lite because that's and that
Oh,
that neighborhood shaped me, and I carry that with me everywhere I go. And you could, as you know, from there you could walk to La Frontera, you could walk to downtown Brownsville, you could walk to Texas Alamos College, where I started my college career many moons ago. And yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Wow, I am just beyond, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that you're from that neighborhood. My grandmother lived on, my Ama Luisa lived on Jackson Street.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I know that area very well. And my dad was always proud to say that he was from the 421. Let me tell you, that was, until he died, that was one of the biggest sources of pride for him. So I think that does capture your background and who you are. And I think right now, people are especially interested in hearing these things about each other. I think now more than ever, because if you look at things like LinkedIn, yeah, it's kind of dried up in terms of what are we all doing? Well, we're all sitting behind our computers. There's nothing fun about that. So why don't we just be real? So thank you for sharing an authentic story about who you are. I don't know how you survived your childhood with five sisters, but we're glad you're here. I'm sure they made you the man you are.
I love them to death, and they in many ways raised me and raised me up to the man that I am today. So I give them, I love them so much. Yeah, we're a very tight family.
That's really good to hear. So everyone, let me formally introduce Felipe, and I have not memorized his bio yet. Give me time. But he is the Director of Undergraduate Studies and an Associate Professor at Texas A&M. Like he mentioned, he was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas. And if you don't know where that is, you should figure it out because it's a wonderful place, part of the Rio Grande Valley. He received his PhD from U of H, go Cougs, and he joined the faculty at A&M that same year. His research studies are very interesting. I've actually talked to people about you who are fascinated by your research studies. And so they include Chicano and Latino studies, American religion, race and ethnicity, and social movements. He's the director of the Carlos Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment, the editor of LatinX Talk, which is an interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and online moderated forum. And he is a published author. And you can find his work in things like Zócalo Public Square, Western Historical Quarterly, American Catholic Studies, Mennonite Quarterly Review, and also has his first book, which I think I just finished ordering. No, I pre-ordered your second book, I think. Latino Mennonite, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture. And that is through Johns Hopkins University Press. And for that one, you received an award, the 2015 Américo Paderes Book Award for the best book in Mexican American and Latino Studies by the Center for Mexican American Studies at South Texas College. Very, very, very important, very wonderful thing to be proud of. And the new book, Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio, out of University of Texas Press, and is set to release in 4 major cities: Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, and New York. Overwhelming background, very powerful scholarly pursuits. Tell us something about your studies and how you ended up where you are. Coming from Brownsville, I'm curious, and I'm sure Daniel is too. What was the draw behind your research studies?
Before I get to the research part of it, I'll just say that, the point where I'm at now, I really, to this day, and I've been teaching at A&M now going on 11 years. Actually, I'm going on my 12th year in the fall next year. I still have to pinch myself. It's not something that was planned. It's not something that I thought, here's what I want to do. my dream was to be a high school teacher and to coach football. I played high school football at Rivera. I loved it. I still love the game so much. I love to see high school kids out there on Friday nights. And that was the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the way, the sort of the simple way to get to it quickly is just to say that I became a nerd. I fell in love with learning and I fell in love with books. And I think it started out as sort of a personal quest. It was this idea of like, how can you grow up in Brownsville?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's raza, right? Everybody. I think at Rivera, we had maybe 5 white kids and probably maybe 2 or 3 African-American kids.
Same.
And that was it. And so, but you also grow up. And so part of you grows up affirmed. Part of you grows up, everybody can say your name.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody likes the same kind of music generally. I mean, you do have, at Rivera, we had the Ralph Lauren polo crowd. We had the goth, we had the Tejano crowd. We had the we had the preppies, we had everybody, we had the jocks. I was more kind of the athlete type. So, I mean, but in that diversity, you still grow up very, very affirmed. And when I left South Texas, when I went to do my undergrad in California, it was the first time that I had come to a place that was predominantly white, where it didn't feel right to me the way that my folks were, the way that we were all sort of being treated and kind of marginalized. And I started to sort of think about, that has everything to do with the fact that I was born and raised in Brownsville and where I was, because I just wasn't going to take it. I just wasn't going to put up with it in the way that other people, not to say that people were passive or weak, but just to say that people were kind of used to it, that kind of engagement with white folks. And I wasn't, I grew up seeing judges were Mexican-American, teachers, principals, everybody in positions of power.
Right.
So that, I think, kind of shaped me. I also, to get to the research part of it, my dad was a minister. My dad was a minister in the church.
And no drinking. Yes, I get it now.
No drinking. Exactly. That's why you have this kid looking over the fence at those Miller Lite barbecues. Thinking, I want a beer too.
Daniel and I are like, no drinking.
No drinking. Yeah.
No drink. Well, I drank, right? But as a family, we didn't, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
Anyway, but my dad was a minister, and not just, we weren't Catholic, we were evangelical, we were Protestant. That's one mark of difference.
That is different.
You know? And the other big one is that we weren't a Pentecostal church. We were a Mennonite church.
Very interesting.
Very different, and a whole nother marker of difference. But just to tell you really quick, my parents were migrant farm workers in the 1960s. They went up and picked tomatoes in Ohio, cherries in Traverse City, Michigan, like a lot of Tejano families did back in those days, that continue to do today. And my parents worked at a Mennonite farm in Ohio. That's how they met these German ethnic whites up in Ohio.
Wow.
And they fell in love with the Mennonites. Déjame decirte por qué. They fell in love with the Mennonites because for my grandmother, faith was my maternal grandmother, Manuela Tijerina, faith was a very, very important thing for her. And Mennonites would give my family and other families Sundays off to go to church.
Really?
And that did it.
That was it.
That was it for my family, because they thought these people are holy people.
Sure.
They certainly weren't. They were like other white people. My family lived in chicken coops. They treated us, the wages were low, all of that. But
Sunday off. Pero Sunday off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So dad comes back and starts a church, and that's where I grow up. I grew up in a church family. The church was off of Minnesota Avenue. When I'm in 7th grade, we moved to that part of Brownsville, which is where the airport is, near the airport.
Oh, yeah.
And where Rivera High School was built in that area, which is why I was zoned for Rivera. And my sisters went to Hanna High School.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah,
anyway.
It's interesting, Felipe, you wrote about this, your experience going to college.
Yes.
I don't know where, I stalk you. So I read the article, the whole article. I can't remember where I read it, but it was enlightening because, and I think I messaged you, I might have emailed you or or sent you a message or something that said, oh my God, our experiences were parallel, because
Yes.
you wrote about how you were this brown kid coming into a new environment and how uncomfortable yet challenge. I mean, it's a great piece, Michelle. I'll email it to you if I can find it again. But I don't remember.
Yeah, I probably already have it. I stalked him too.
But yeah, I remember reading
that piece. My time at Fresno Pacific University, the small liberal arts, predominantly white college, was very traumatic, but it was good. It was good for me. I needed I wasn't disciplined. I worked at the Sears at the mall in Brownsville, in the paint department. I graduated from high school, and I was still in that kind of high school life in the 90s. And so I knew I needed to leave, and I wanted to leave, and I left. I just took off because I knew it wasn't that my friends were bad. It was just that I didn't see a trajectory for me any other way. And so leaving and going there was good, but it was very, very difficult. No money. My parents couldn't help me. Had to get out loans from a lot of money, all of that stuff that, when I look at it now and I think of myself back then, I'm scared for me back then.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because I feel the same way. For me to go from Blinn College, that was like 40 minutes from my house, my mom and dad would come pick me up on the weekends because I didn't have a car. And then for me to all of a sudden say, I'm going to go 9 hours away to Lubbock. And I remember my mom and dad saying, mijo, pero por qué? Right? And now I look back and I'm like so scared. Why would they let me do that? But in the end, it worked out.
I was thinking about, before we start the questions, you mentioned that one of the most empowering things about growing up in the Valley, surrounded by everyone who looks like us and acts like us, even if they aren't us, they still look like us and act like us, was the affirmation of having that. I've never considered that, Felipe, but I think it's funny because now I can look back and now I understand why people said to me, you walk into a room and you don't even look around. Like you think, te crees mucho, right? No.
No, Michelle, no, I get it. I totally understand.
But it's interesting because it struck a chord with me, Felipe, when you said you were affirmed, because I grew up in an opposite environment, right? I grew up in a small rural town in Central Texas, where despite that I'm brown, everybody is asking, are you really brown or Italian, right? And I grew up in an environment where it was predominantly Black and predominantly white, either or, except for my family. And I had a large family, but except for my family, it wasn't. And so I would argue that I was unaffirmed, right? I had to learn how to become affirmed through looking at different cultures and people and imagining what it would be like to see somebody to look like me. So it struck a chord with me even when you said that you were affirmed, because my entry in was and still is at times, as I was sharing a story with you before, of being unaffirmed, right? Like I'm not affirmed and I'm unsure, but have to imagine a world where I could be because it hasn't ever been. So that's interesting.
Yeah. There's something there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Michelle, just to go back to the point you made earlier, I think in the Valley, to a certain extent, we're a little chocantes. And I think that, I don't know, how do you even translate chocantes? But there's like a belief in ourselves. Like we walk around like we own this, you know what I mean? Like
it's not being a show off. It's more, if there's a confidence, it is a very deeply rooted, cheerful confidence.
Yeah.
But explain that to me. I mean, explain to somebody who might be watching us who is white and only English speaker, how you would interpret that so that I can better understand it. Because I hear you, I know what you're talking about, but what is the translation?
I think one way to sort of think about it is that when we talk about race and when we talk about identity in the United States, I think a big part of it and a big component of it has everything to do with the way whiteness is ubiquitous, the way that whiteness sort of controls every aspect, whether we're talking public school systems, the kind of leadership that we see, our interactions with police officers. And I think for us in the Valley, it's not to say that white supremacy somehow stops, at the Nueces River and doesn't go down to the Rio Grande or whatever.
Right.
Absolutely. But just to say that when you grow up in that environment, I think the notion, and we're going to get to this later, but the notion that the Latino community is diverse or that we're not a monolith is not a surprise, because you grow up going to high school with people that are the preps, the jocks, the goths, the heavy metal, the tejano, everybody's there. People see border communities and they see us in one way, but when you're from there, you're like, nah, that's not the way it is. Us is very different. There's, middle class, upper class, got people in the barrio. I mean, it's
right.
very
It's a tapestry. I recently wrote something, an experience that you might understand, Felipe, because we grew up on a border town. Remembering going to Matamoros when I was young with my grandmother, and I grew up poor, but then I crossed the border and there are these poor kids, right, begging with the, selling the chiclets and living under the bridge, and identifying with them because they're poor, but realizing that they're more poor than I am. I still didn't have it good though. I still didn't have it good. And then having a sense of shame because here are these kids living under a bridge, but they have money in their hands and they understand how it works. And so in that way, they were superior to me because they understood capital. I didn't have any money in my hands. I wasn't exchanging money with people or selling my wares in any way. And so there's this dichotomy. There's this sense of I am a lot of different things just being a Latina, and I can't be categorized. And that's why Daniel wanted to talk about the idea of, okay, so suddenly in this election, we're this one population. The hell we are. We are not, It's a very complicated identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that gives us a really good jump into this, Michelle. Let's jump right into it about the election. So, we know the outcome. Well, most of us know the outcome. There are some of us who are still scratching our head and living in an imaginary land that can imagine.
Go tell the current occupant of the White House, right?
Right, but we know the outcome, right? And so for some of us who supported Biden, we're excited about the possibilities. And I know me personally, my wife and I literally cried when they called it because of the sense of relief of what we've been through and not realizing just how traumatic this has been for us. It is exciting to live a new day in America where we see hope again, we see compassion and competence and science and education appreciated, or at least we believe it's going to, and have every reason with no doubt to believe that it will. So tell us a little bit, Felipe, about the election. Tell us what were your thoughts about it for you as a specific Latino male, as an academician, as a scholar, as someone who represents your area. Tell us about your region. I mean, you live in a conservative area. Tell us about what it means for Latinos and what we should take away from the election. I mean, you're brilliant. So share with us your thoughts.
I mean, I think just like everybody else, I was on pins and needles on November 3rd on that night. And it's been, well, let me take you back to 2016. I think we all can sort of go back and remember the feeling and the emotion that we had that Wednesday morning. I literally remember taking my kids to school and wanting to make sure that at least I could project a sense of normalcy to them, even though knowing within me that things were not normal. And I remember that morning, I had to do something. I had to write. I had to put my thoughts on paper. And the only thing that I could think about was my maternal grandparents, Felix and Manuela Tijerina. And I thought of them because whenever they would make a trip north with all of the anxieties of migrant labor, with all of the fears and the stress of having a lot of kids in that truck, they did it, and they went into that and they would pray. They were a very spiritual and religious family. And I looked to gain strength from that. And I think that has been what has carried me, is to think about the ways in which my ancestors have struggled in the past and the way that they've made it, to this day. And that carried me these last 4 years. I think, coming to the point of on this Tuesday in 2020, on November 3rd, it was very much, I think, for me, a sense of relief and emotion on that Saturday morning. I got up early that day. I was working, and I'm checking Twitter, right? Seeing if they're going to break it and what's going to happen. And they did. And it was just like this huge load just off of my back. I think we're not going to move on from this very quickly. This is going to be with us because Trump has tapped into, a white nationalism and a white supremacy that has always been a part of this nation. And, I don't think, Biden is a savior by any stretch of the imagination, but at least there's a sense of normalcy and decency that he will project. And that means a whole hell of a lot, right? I think Trump sort of tapping that white nationalism and white supremacy is what is going to remain with us. On top of the fact that I had to question myself and my community for how is it that the numbers in the Latino community went up for Trump. My gender, right? For Latino males, we went up for Trump. I'm always very optimistic about my people. I tend to defend them to the very end. And when I saw people writing about South Texas and the RGV on Twitter, I got upset and I would respond and still say, hey, look, the valley's going blue. I don't care what you say. And it did. People, start texting me or emailing me about Zapata County going red. I said, that's not the valley. So leave that out of it. But the fact that, Biden won by a significantly lower margin than what Clinton did and even what Obama did, mind you, in a moment where many thought that Latinos would, one, never vote for an African-American candidate, and two, never vote for a female candidate. They did both, and they came out in large numbers in South Texas. So I'm still dealing with and grappling with what happened, and why so many of my folk in Hidalgo and Cameron and Starr County voted for Trump.
Why do you think? Because that's, I read the same things. I'm from the Valley too. And I feel as though my identity is under a microscope, and it's offensive, especially when some of it is true. Some of the things that I'm hearing are true, when some of my own family members have stars in their eyes over this racist, bigoted, xenophobic, white nationalist. And what you said is, and I want you to really dig into this for us because I have an idea of where we're going, but what you said is he tapped into this fear, and it is a very real fear, but we've never had that fear because we were chocante, right? We've always had this pride and this confidence, and whether we had it because of where we're from, Daniel, or we developed it through an illustrious career like yours, right? We've never had that fear. And now all of a sudden you're striking a chord in me that I never had to worry about.
Yeah.
So why do you think our people have been entranced by this person?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I don't think it's a sign of more things to come. People were all of a sudden comparing us to South Florida, and Cuban American vote. I think that's absolutely ridiculous, number one. But on the other hand, I think we've got some soul searching to do. We really, really do. I don't know. I could probably guess some reasons. I think that I think there's a sense of power that Trump projected that appealed to men, to Latino men in particular. I think there was a sense that, the economy in some respect was going well. And, I as far as that goes, I don't know where else to take it other than, it only affirmed what we believe in the Valley, which is in the Valley we're people of law and order. There's a strong tradition of military service.
Sure.
all of that. But there's always been that. And people still voted for Clinton and still voted for that community organizer, Barack Hussein Obama, right?
Right.
So this is different. And I think I'm still in many ways trying to figure it out. I don't know. I think there's something in that appeal that came across to people as powerful, and some people fell for it.
Well, I think though it's interesting because I come from a community where now it's more Latino than it was when I was there, and it's very rural, and it has always been and will forever be very Republican. And I have family members, many that are in my hometown and many that are in the suburbs of Houston, who were dazzled by this buffoon. And what you hear if you listen to not respond, but to listen to understand, is a vulnerability. And I'm going to speak to this that may be somewhat confusing, but Trump was very vulnerable in some aspects that was very attractive to men, and particularly disenfranchised men, where even the tagline "Make America Great Again," and engage them in an environment of the past, right? Of what that meant, of being, stronger back then, right? Of what it meant in terms of I'm going to be a machismo man, and don't go with them. Yeah, don't go with them because I'm going to do better for you on the economy, right? And what you find really in these elections, from what I look at, is really rural versus urban. And these rural areas that are struggling, where hospitals are shutting down, jobs are being turned away, and they're not as educated about the reality of the complexity of an economy in the United States. They associate that with the Democrats. And he did a really good job, Trump, of being vulnerable with them and saying, I know what it feels like to do that, when he's lying. This man does not know what it's like to lose a job and not eat, obviously. Right? But when you think about it, he was being vulnerable in so many ways to a community that had never been spoken to in that way. And when I look at these Hispanic men that associated with it, some of it was machismo, right? But the other part of it was that he was fighting for me, who has been disenfranchised by the economy, who's been disenfranchised by women, that's gone taken advancements that I didn't get, and really sees a play on immigration as a changing experience. And in the past, these immigrants worked hard to get what they want. And nowadays, right? Nowadays, they get it all handed to them. So it's not.
So he tapped into their Uncle Rico. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
Young, I used to be strong. I want to be young and strong again. And if I'm just a total, I'm not going to say it, but if I'm just ugly to people and I can see where you're going. I mean, yeah, I think that holds water, Daniel. I do.
Well, think about his argument with Biden being old. Compadre, you're not that far from him, right? But it's still, he's old and in the basement. Well, you're old and fat. Like, I mean,
yeah.
I think, to some extent, it probably, shouldn't surprise us too much. On the other extent, I find hope in knowing that, the Valley is always a very resilient place. It's always a place where people will shock you and where people will turn things around quickly. We're a hardworking group of folk. And so I have every belief that, things will improve and people will continue to make lives, their lives better as they go. I think one area that gives me tremendous hope is if you think about Tarrant County in North Texas,
right?
That shift, or if you think about the coalitions with Native American folk in Arizona to flip Arizona.
Yep.
Those are some powerful narratives that I think people who get fixated on this kind of conservative shift forget about the fact that because we're not a monolith, that there's going to be different kinds of voting trends in different kinds of places. I also think, and let me just say this, and I disagree on some extent with what some of the pundits have been writing about when they talk about, especially South Texas, and that is to say, if you have a legitimate ground game, and we couldn't because of COVID,
right,
in the Valley, but if you would have had a legitimate Biden ground game the way Obama and the way Clinton did, and even the way, if we're going to switch Republican, even the way George W. Bush did, you don't lose that big a ground in South Texas. And I think some people say it wouldn't have mattered if you would have had a lot of people knocking on doors. I disagree. I think people would have been apt to listen,
Yeah.
but some people didn't know Biden. Who was he? Where did, he was a vice president, but we never really saw him as much.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you say that you ended with the hope, because one of the questions I wrote down when you were talking about your grandparents and how they were, kind of charmed by the Mennonites because of that Sunday off, I wrote down the question so that sense that we always have as Latinos, that we are, we'll hang on to the one good thing that you are, and we will stay loyal to that thing. So you may be a problem in all other areas. You could be my crazy cousin who starts fights everywhere we go, but you had my back, right? That one time, and I'm never going to forget it. So I was wondering, is that a blessing or is that a curse? But when you said, I still see hope for the future, you're looking deeper than that one thing. You're looking beyond our own culture, which I think I needed that hope. It is more hopeful than just pinning it on us as one culture. You're saying, you know what, there are other people like us who share values like we do, who also can be empowered to do the kinds of things that we know our culture can do. And I agree on the ground game, because we are a storytelling culture. We are a social culture. And so I agree on that.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, in terms of that hope, it's never a surprise to me that a lot of the young people that end up being the leaders at A&M in terms of student activism are the ones that are coming from these historic areas in Texas. The Valley, for sure. A lot of kids that come from the Valley, when they get here, they end up being the leaders of a lot of student orgs. South Dallas, Oak Cliff, that whole barrio, that whole area there. Anywhere in Houston, right? The west side of San Antonio. These areas where we are in large population numbers, students come here and they change this institution bit by bit. That gives me hope all the time, because I think about the generation that's up and coming now, a generation which, by the way, was raised on immigrant rights marches from 2006. That generation that was in high school in 06 got to A&M in 2010, 2011, and started marching for Latino studies on this campus. We've never had Latino studies. We're 50 years behind UT Austin. And it was that generation of kids that had marched with their parents in these big immigrant rights marches, if you remember those back in 06.
Yeah.
It was that generation of kids, and every generation that comes up is coming through that, and it gives me a lot of hope. The other part that I'll mention is that, we are almost, we're jokesters. People like to have a good time. People like to barbecue. I can drink Miller Lite now. It's great. I can all of that. But like whenever I start to have these discussions with people that I know are very Trump supporters, I love the way that they're like, pero pa qué te enojas? Vamos a tomar. It's all of that, right? But you can still, you want to wring their neck, and you're like, you need to take this seriously. They're like, I will. Well, you better give me another beer, that sort of thing. I think people miss that if they just poll. If you're just looking at polling numbers, you miss that nuance that I think Raza, not just in the Valley, but everywhere, tend to have. We're a people that, you meet somebody for the first time, and if I know you and you bring a friend with you, that friend, aquí tienes tu casa.
Exactly.
Aquí tienes tu casa.
That's right.
Tú eres amigo o amiga de so-and-so que yo conozco, aquí tienes tu casa. Exactly. I love that.
So Felipe, when it comes to the state of Latinos in the area of future elections, would you say that the state is good?
Oh, I think so. People, all this doom and gloom. No. Look, number one, demography is not destiny. Okay. So we can't just rely on the fact that big numbers are going to take us over the top.
Right.
People have been wishing that Texas would go blue the last, I don't know how many elections. It's not just about demographics. It's about a commitment from educators like yourselves, like me, that are committed to our community and committed to doing not just work in the classroom, but stuff like this that people can tune into and listen to and have a conversation around. Because when you don't when you don't hear your story, when it's not reiterated, when you don't see it represented in pop culture or in museums, you start to really believe that, well, maybe we didn't do anything that of significance, right? And so I think as more and more of us kind of do that public work and that
Right.
public history work, that's going to, I think, fundamentally begin to create a narrative about who we are. As you're building a base, as you're building a future, you have to have a narrative, a story. What is your story? This is something that African Americans have done very well in this country, in being able to take the pain and the grief and the destruction and the violence of slavery and be able to craft a narrative story that not just uplifts, although it does, but it also is honest and true and doesn't sidestep the pain that's there. Brian Stevenson, the guy that does the Just Mercy work in Alabama, and he's got that new lynching museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Brian Stevenson talks about concretizing history. And if we could think about ways in which we can make Latino history real for our parents and for our grandparents, for our tios, tias, for people that are not taking the Chicano studies class, that's critical. And I see good work going out there, and that is what gives me hope for sure.
You know, Felipe, I think that's, it's just a brilliant response, which is, what we expect from you. And, I taught my first Mexican American Humanities class this semester and had such joy learning so much about it and being able to share it with our students. And, at the community college that I taught it, it's the first semester we're teaching it, and it's 2020 again. But at least I had the pleasure of being able to be the inaugural faculty to teach that course. So I was really excited about that. But one of the questions, and it'll be the final question on the election before we move off, is, you talked about the education and setting a foundation and the demographic shift of Latinos. But, for me, one of the things I don't see is these advocates, these change agents, these national representatives of Latinos that can lead. When I talk about that, I talk about when I turn on CNN or MSNBC and I can see Al Sharpton, and I can see Jesse Jackson, and I can see Stacey Abrams now, and I can see all of these people who have major influence within their culture, right, to be able to shift a culture or sway it minimally to help. For Latinos, I still don't see that national presence, that national change agent. How do we get there? What do we do to that? Is it only in time that it's going to happen? Or is that even relevant for our population because we're so disaggregated in terms of subcultures?
No, I think it's very relevant. And I think the media has done, a job of just marginalizing us, not contacting us, not tapping into some of our most brilliant minds, people that should be on that CNN desk, people that should be at that national, position in terms of being able to talk intelligently about our community. No, there's a lot of frustration about that. And I think there has been for a long, long time. Many of our most prized journalists tend to be much more regional, LA Times people, San Antonio, Houston, certainly the Valley or Chicago and New York. But it's been a struggle. I think maybe the closest that we've gotten was Jorge Ramos.
Yeah.
Or Maria Cristina Garcia. And even they, to a large extent, are often not a part of that conversation. And I think, it's very frustrating, Daniel. I think you're exactly right. You hit on something that, we have to continue to push for and have to continue to push for that representation, because if not, we're going to be continually misunderstood. Mm-hmm. But it's not for a lack of not having enough PhDs or not having enough people who know. We have an abundance of folks. And, we still get left out of that conversation.
Yeah, that one's going to stick with me for a while, because when I came out of high school, my goal was I was going to be the Latina Barbara Walters.
Oh, yeah.
I went into communications and I was going to be a reporter and I was going to be an anchor and I was going to have my own show. That was my goal. But I got to the communications department and it was so cutthroat. There was no laughing. There was no one was friends with anyone else. It was just, we're here to, slice each other's throats and make it to the top. and I just didn't fit in there. I just couldn't live that life. So I changed my major to English.
Yeah. Hey, I was an English major too. Look at that.
Were you at U of H?
No, at Fresno, my undergrad.
Oh yeah, that's right. You did your undergrad in California. That's right.
Yeah.
So awesome.
No, I think you're touching on an important point, and it's one that I'm hoping, if anything good comes out of COVID, it's going to be that we're familiarizing ourselves with these mediums, these forms of communication, like you all are doing, and when we do these things, when it's this grassroots stuff, we're really sort of following in the tradition of other Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans and other Dominicans and other groups that in the past have been left out of that conversation. And I've said, if you're not going to include us, then we're just going to make our own thing. We're going to have our own broadcast channels. We're going to write our own newspapers. African Americans have done it. Latinos have done it. And I think now in the era of COVID, when a lot of us are learning multimedia and trying to new microphones and lighting and stuff, I think it's going to transform the game.
Watch out, right? Watch out for us. So Felipe, shifting to another topic we want to talk about is family structure and really generational differences among a family structure with Latinos. We know that there are so many people who live in cross-generational homes, maybe 2-3 generations, and now in this environment with COVID-19, perhaps are struggling more than ever with these differences. Right. Talk to us a little bit about the family structure within Latinos and how generational differences really are impacting not only the day-to-day lives, but maybe some change politically or socially that's happening in our society.
Everything you just mentioned feels so normal to me. A lot of people living in one house.
It is normal.
Generational. When my parents sold the house on Taylor Street, we were on Taylor Street, and they moved in with a sister of mine in Brownsville. And in that house, my sister, who's, she's grown, she's, in her 50s, late 50s probably, and, has grown children of her own. Her children have children. They're all there. They're all there. My parents, my sister, her husband, their children, and their grandchildren are all living, under that roof. And you think about sort of the stress that goes into that, especially under COVID, and thinking about the struggles that families have had to sort of endure during this time. I think one of the things that we've been trying to do, and I'll speak just out of a personal level here, is we have a family group chat like many families probably do. Right. And when school was starting, it was like, okay, who needs an iPad? Who needs materials? Because some schools, we didn't know if schools were going to give out devices or not. Back in July, it was scary. And who needs childcare, and what can we do to help each other do all of these things? Because within one Latino family, you have so many different layers of professionalism to no college degree at all, to people that have done not so great things in life and have ended up in prison or jail, whatever it is. You have all of that, and all of that's there. You really start to value the fact that as Latinos, one of the things we do best is we look after each other. We do really well at that, I think. At least I'm very hopeful that we do.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's what I see, and that's, when I think about kind of people talk about no homelessness in the Valley. It's not that there's no homelessness; it's that people live with other family members, and so in one home, it's very normal to have another, either the grandparents are living there, or you have a daughter or a son or somebody or another family that's living there with you. When we were growing up in our tiny house on Taylor Street, we always had people coming through our house and staying there. It wasn't always the best situation when you've got 5 girls in one house and these men from somewhere are coming to stay there.
Right.
You got to be really careful with all that stuff. And so, but that was our house, for better or worse,
There are two things that I wanted to explore. Sorry, Daniel.
No, go ahead.
One of them was the idea of, so the 3 of us, for example, are obviously different. We're not the norm. We are not, what you see every day in Latinos, 3 folks with doctorates, one of them about to have his doctorate. How does that change the family structure, especially when it comes to things like COVID or to the election? Because I certainly have felt a little different from my family, in Brownsville and other parts, because I've addressed this, pandemic differently. I have also thought about the election and the issues differently than, the traditional family structures. That's one side of it that I want you to think about. Of having that degree, which is just not so common. I think we're 2% of the population. The other side of it is because we're all educators. Because of the way that we grew up with these family structures. I grew up with my grandparents. I didn't live with my parents. I grew up with my aunts and uncles as my brothers and sisters. So because we have this familiarity with the multi-generational home, I feel that it has brought something to our careers in that we understand our Latino students so much better. And I wonder if we do enough to advocate for those students. I know I'm always bringing it up. These students aren't just coming to class. They're dropping off their grandmother at the doctor, and then they're taking their sister to work, and then they're coming to class, and then they have to go early because they, on one hand, what does it feel like to be that educated Latino in the family, hyper educated? And on the other hand, do we do enough with who we are to become those advocates?
Yeah, those are two great questions. There's a part of you that your family sees, at least in my family situation, sees as, very intelligent, kind of a know-it-all. Let me go to him or her, for every answer. What do you think about this? No, pues Felipe sabe, pregunta, he'll tell you, and then there's the fact that, at least with me, I'm the youngest of 7. I'm still the little brother of 5 sisters and a brother. And so there's still that sense of deference that I carry for them and honor in the work that they do and value who they are.
Yeah, and I think that's native to our culture, that respect. Yeah,
that respect is central. When things like this come up, or even when politics comes up, I just always try to keep in mind the way that I learned and the way that I came to sort of a political consciousness. It wasn't by somebody yelling at me. It wasn't somebody getting angry with me.
It wasn't on Facebook fights.
It wasn't with Facebook fights.
When Felipe does a Facebook fight, I've noticed he'll put, to all you Trump supporters, smiley face and a heart.
Yeah, I always want to make sure they know I gotta show them some love, right? I think there's that sense of like, that respect that you carry for your family and all of that, and the fact that you're still kind of the younger sibling, and in learning all of this, and even talking to different political views in my family, although our family isn't that divergent politically, it's more with kind of primos and primas, kind of that I might have issues. But I always remember what it took with me, and I try to model that, although it's not always easy. I try to model that as often as I can, because I know that one of the keys for me to come to political consciousness was somebody listened to me. Mm-hmm. He took my thoughts seriously and was willing to listen and was willing to challenge and to push back, but never demeaned, never ridiculed, never called me dumb or stupid or anything. And these days, I think it's taken a lot, but I think it's something I think it's a practice that we have to carry every single day. And especially those of us with the kind of hyper education that you talked about, the responsibility is heightened. Mm-hmm. It's almost like it's more, you just have to kind of carry that. That doesn't mean you're passive. That doesn't mean you let it go. That doesn't mean you let it slide. I have a thing on Facebook too. My sort of philosophy is, if I know you and I care about you, I'm going to reach out for you. I'm going to come get you through that screen. But if I don't know you, if I don't have a relationship with you, say what you want, I'm going to ignore you. It's not worth getting into it with you. But if you're my nephew, if you're my cousin, I'm going to direct message you and be like, how's going on here?
I did that too. Yeah, I totally get that. And I appreciate that. Now, with your background, how has that played out for you in the classroom whenever you have had students from the Valley like you? What have you brought to the professional arena at A&M to show us that, you know, you're advocating for us? Aside from all of your accolades and amazing work, of course.
Yeah, I think for me, and I try to practice this every single day, it's empathy. It's empathy for my students. It's understanding where they're coming from. I get chills just thinking about it now, because you remember what it was like to be an undergraduate student and to walk into a professor's office. I mean, I remember being an English major, and I wrote a paper, and the professor called me in to talk to him, and I was so intimidated to go into that office, and he didn't help. He projected power and all of that, which I think is just a load of crap. But you know, he did that, and I was intimidated. But I misspelled grammar. How do you
ER, right? ER.
I spelled it ER. It's AR. How, and he just scratched it, and he was so upset. And I thought to myself at that moment, I'll never forget that, because I remember thinking, if I'm ever a teacher, I'm not going to do that to a kid. You know, I'm going to say, yeah, we got to fix that, but I'm not going to demean you or try to hurt you in any particular way. And I think when you can see yourself in your students, and when you understand the struggles that they're going through, and understand that they have no reason to lie to you. You know, if you're lying to me, if you're lying to me, then bueno, I'm easy to lie to, whatever. But I'm gonna believe you because I believe you, because you're one of my students, and I care deeply about you. And so that's one thing I try to practice. It's not always easy, and that also goes for my white students that come into my office angry with me, crying because I said something that undermined everything that they thought about their own identity or their own life. And I have to sit there and think, I'm an educator. My job here is to make sure that this student leaves my office with a feeling of understanding rather than anger. Absolutely. And I always, with my white students, I'm always, the first question for them is, who are you? What's your story? Tell me about you. Because I don't want to get into this topic here without understanding where you're from, what your parents did for a living. Let's get to know each other. Let's have a relationship. And I'm hoping that will build better understanding.
I think it will. I think it's funny that you said that about empathy. Not funny, haha, but I was thinking about that part of our culture that we're going to say, all kinds of bad things about someone, and we're gonna pile on the way that we do in our culture, because if you're not at the party, then you're the one getting talked about. But at some point, somebody's gonna say, "Ay, but pobrecito," we do have that empathy for everyone. So even when you're challenged in the classroom, even when, I don't know so much, because Daniel's way of dealing with people who are ignorant and asking dumb questions is usually, Daniel, what is the line? Explain to me.
Yeah, please help me to understand your perspective, because I don't get it, right?
But we do have that sense of empathy too. Yeah.
That's great, Daniel. That's perfect. I love it.
I tell you what, I have an entire coded language of how I ask a question from my Mexican culture into a white professional environment, right? So many times I say, can you help me understand, which really is, ¿qué? What the hell are you talking about? That doesn't make no sense. Right, yeah. But it's coded language that we have to use in a different environment.
Right.
So Daniel, I think what Felipe is saying regarding the family structure is that the state of Latinos is good, right? Yeah. We have what we need to figure out where we go from here, and there's a lot of strength within the way that the family structure has persisted. How has that persisted over these years? That's a topic for another day, but there is a lot of beauty in it. And I think we are who we are because we have experienced having our cousins live with us, right? And having our grandparents on top of us all the time. I think that's the beauty of why we are an empathetic culture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, for about 6 or 8 months, we lived with my grandparents while I was probably in elementary school. I can't really name you the timeline, but I have some very fond memories of my grandmother after school picking me up, and couldn't read or write English, but would say, "Mijo, sit at the end of the table. I'm gonna make some tortillas, and you need to start your homework. It's really important that you get your homework done, right?" And those are some of the fondest memories that I have, because here she was, an older lady who was uneducated in her own right, did not know how to do anything outside of the household, didn't drive until she needed to learn how to drive to go pick us up from school, would go straight there, come home. But the most prized possession that I have from her is her molcajete that she would cook with after school, and it's my most prized possession from her, right? And it's a memory that I remember living in her home with, and that's probably where I started to get fat, right? Is at her house, where cooking became the norm, and mijo, here's some more, mijo, here's some more, here's some more, and then eat some more vitamins, and here's another tortilla, and here I am today, right? So I still blame that on my grandma, but those are some fond memories, and I think the outlook is really, really good.
Yeah, the way that I think about it is when we think about ethnic studies or Chicano studies or Latino studies, it's interesting because a way of thinking about education that we've always sort of been taught is that education was a way out. It was a way to get you
That's true.
that house with the 2.5 kids and the white picket fence and all of that. And that's fine. I tell my students, go get the car of your dreams, go get your house, whatever you want, get it. But it's interesting to me, what I see after a student takes a Latino history class is that it's a pathway to back in. It's a road back in, because all of a sudden I'm asking questions about their grandparents. Who's your family? Who are they? And they're going to talk to them. And the grandparents are like, "You've never asked me these questions." And I'm like, "Well, now I'm asking you." And it's interesting that it happens in college, because supposedly college is the place that gets you out and you're going to go see the world. But I would tell students, you can't be ready to see the world until you know what world you come from and what your story is and all of that.
Felipe, that's astonishing, because I took my first Chicano and Latinx course at Texas Tech on accident. And I really didn't know that I was Mexican until I took this course. And one of the assignments was to go back and interview your grandparents. And so I interviewed them for hours and recorded it, right? Now they've since passed. And I'll release snippets to my family on, oh, here's what my grandfather thought about my grandmother, on special occasions and things. But you're right. I wanted to know more about who I was and where I was coming from. And I could have learned it in that damn small town that I was in. But it took me to go all the way to Tech to have a scholar kind of reintroduce me to this. And that's fascinating, quite fascinating of your assessment of that.
Yeah.
Very true. I really like that too. And I agree. We do have to know ourselves. And I hope we all teach that to our children. Let me ask you now, let's take a break from these heavy issues and tell us about your book, your latest book, how you came to this topic. And now I get to explain to our previous guest, Fernando Benavides. He was fascinated by you. He's like, he's a Mennonite. That is interesting. How did this? Now I can tell him, watch the episode, but I'm going to text him here in a little bit on WhatsApp and tell him. But tell us about the book. This sounds so interesting.
Apostles of Change is a book that I've been working on for about 8 years now. I started in 2012. And it really, I think it came out of this idea that much of what I was studying in grad school, in Chicano seminars and in Latino history seminars and in American history seminars in general, very little of that talked about the kind of religious experiences that I had growing up as a kid, which I believed were not unique. I couldn't have been the only, Mexican American kid that had a church that was active in its community and that was open to the neighborhood, all of that.
Right.
And so I just sort of wondered why nobody had written about this. And so I have committed my career, I think, as a lot of the great writers advise you to do. If there's a book out there that you wish you could read, maybe, and it's not there, maybe you're the one that needs to write it.
That's right.
And that has stuck with me. But this story of church occupations stuck with me, and I felt like it was this idea that I had in 2012, where I started learning about these radical Latino and African American activists in urban communities, in big cities, that at that time you have white flight. So you have a lot of churches that are leaving the inner city and are taking off to the suburbs, and churches are leaving too. So you have these empty buildings, right? And that was the case in Houston. There's another phenomenon that's also going on, which is that of urban renewal. And that was a pushing out of poor people from particular neighborhoods that business owners and entrepreneurs saw as vital to economic growth. So Houston is white flight. The South is very much that. Chicago and LA is about this kind of urban renewal thing that's going on. And when I first learned that these activists were actually walking into churches and disrupting church services, as a kid that grew up in church, I couldn't imagine it. Like it just freaked, like it's a crazy idea. And I learned about it first in Chicago, and I learned that it was happening on all across the country. But I thought it was an African-American phenomenon early on, because that's what I had learned and read about. That's a lot of the writing is done on that. And I did a little bit of research and found that it happened in Latino communities as well, and I was hooked. It was like one of your friends comes picks you up and wants to go to a party, and you're like, I don't know, I'm kind of tired, and that friend keeps honking like, no, dude, we're going to this party. It was that idea was honking outside of my house and wasn't going to leave. It was like, you got to write this book. You better write this book. And I remember going to my colleagues at A&M thinking, this is crazy. Radicals occupying churches, that's not a book. And they were like, yeah, it could be. I mean, you should write it. See what happens. And I started experimenting, and 8 years later, it's going to be published in January of next year. So it's coming out.
Who were some key people that encouraged you or helped you through this process? Because like you said, you were embarking on something that hasn't existed until now. Yeah,
I think, well, first of all, I think there were a lot of people in my field in Chicano history that were like, oh, that happened? Oh, okay, that's cool. That's cool. Okay. There's like a phenomenon in Chicano history that whenever you talk about religion, they're like, oh shit, Felipe is religious now.
You're like, no, I drink Miller Lite. It's okay.
I have to tell them all the time.
So you can't broach this conversation. You got to talk about your book while you're holding a beer.
Right. Wait, I need a beer, right? But it's fascinating because one of my friends growing up, he used alliteration, and I grew up Mennonite, and he said, "Are you guys the Miller Lite church?" Because he is Mennonite and Miller Lite. I'm gonna have to get Miller Lite the next time we talk. But but it wasn't. I think my colleagues and people that I work with, to some extent, people had heard about these occupations, but everybody thought it was a one-shot deal. Nothing came of it. Why would you write about this? They were kicked out after 11 days. There's really nothing too significant about it. But when you start doing research, it's like anything. You start to realize that the web of entanglements, the politics, the ways in which religion mattered to Latino and Latina activists in neighborhoods, that was very significant to me. And you ask about encouragement. It wasn't until I found the activists that occupied these churches, when I went to do oral histories with them in Chicago and New York and LA and Houston. When I met them, they were the ones that were like, you got to tell this story.
Wow.
And one activist in LA actually blew me away, because every time you think about the Chicano movement in LA, you think about these badasses and chingonas and chingones, right? I mean, and they were all of that, no doubt about it. But one of the activists from back in the day me dijo, without the church, we don't have a Chicano movement in LA.
You're kidding me.
Stuck with me.
I would have not made that connection, Felipe.
No, I wouldn't have either, but it makes a lot of sense, because if you think about it, it was Church of the Epiphany in the Lincoln Heights neighborhood that opened the doors to a ragtag bunch of brown berets, these Black Panther folks in militancy. They were like the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
And it was the church leadership never judged these kids. They let these kids mess up. They let these kids make mistakes, and they let these kids build a movement. And without that church, people needed a place to meet, to plan, to organize, and churches were empty Monday through Friday or through Saturday. So when you have something like that happen, it's quite significant. And I had never heard it, just like you said right now, Michelle, I had never heard it that clearly before. And it just affirmed that I needed to write it.
Tell me the name of the church again.
Church of the Epiphany in Los Angeles. That church, by the way, is a very famous church for the Chicano movement because the newspaper, La Raza newspaper, which was basically the newspaper in charge of documenting the movement,
Right.
Yeah.
it officed out of the church.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't know that.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
The church was a gathering place for Chicano and Chicana activists in LA to come together, plan, organize, what are we going to do, all of that.
How beautiful is that?
It became, and it's still an activist-oriented church to this day.
So Felipe, let me ask you a real tough question then. And this is thinking about the role of the church as you just described it with activism back then. With politics where we are today, could that ever happen today? Where the role of the church with the Democratic Party where they are in terms of religion and abortion and pro-life and pro-choice, could that ever happen again?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. And let me tell you, I've had it up to here. Actually, I've had it up to here with this notion. I'm over it. I'm so over it. This notion that somehow conservatives have a monopoly on American Christianity or a monopoly on faith in general.
And patriotism.
And not just Christianity. I'm talking about multiple religious backgrounds here, but the idea that somehow there are progressive people of faith simply do not exist is a complete myth. And it's not just me projecting, it's what is happening on the ground, where churches, especially responding during this pandemic, have been doing amazing work in turning sanctuaries into food pantries. Look at what happened in Houston. You followed the Sanctuaries of Learning program, where churches opened their doors to working families, working parents who could not leave their kids at home. So it's no, absolutely. I just think that the progressive, more liberal church doesn't get the kind of press that conservative Christians do.
No, they don't. They absolutely don't. And because there's a stigma attached to the things that they are, supporting and embracing. Right. That was a good question, Daniel. I like that one. That was a really good question. And actually, as someone who hasn't found a religious identity that I have been comfortable with yet, and I've tried them all, right? I've tried the Baptist church. I've tried the Catholic church. I think my favorite thing that you've said is that, progressive people, who are religious do exist and that there is a path for that. So
I think you just can't. I mean, people talk about the vote. We were talking about the vote earlier. They were talking about how Christians and Latino evangelicals voted in large numbers for Trump. And I think the numbers were higher than the general population for Latinos. I think it's like 45, 46%.
Yeah.
And that's whatever. You can take those numbers and run with them.
Sure.
But if you don't understand that the coalition in Arizona or Tarrant County, or even in the Valley or any urban community where Latinos voted, I guarantee you those Latinos went to church on Sunday.
Yeah.
They might not have been at this sort of, progressive, radical left, whatever kind of church, but they went to church and faith influenced how they voted in against Trump, especially.
Right.
I think that's an interesting point, that faith, because I'm a man of faith. We are Catholics, and so, but to your point, we are more so associated with pro-life in that stance than we are. But my religion affected the way that I impacted the way I voted, and it was for morals. It was for the way that we treat people. It was for humane behavior of immigrant children and families crossing the border, right? So it played a much different role in what society or the mainstream media might have showcased.
Everything you see happening in Brownsville with people going to help the asylum seekers in Matamoros, Arizona, those are all communities of faith.
Yeah, that's my high school English teacher, Melba Lucio, who is, I think, they're working on a documentary for the asylum, help that's happening right there in Matamoros. That's an interesting tie. I really like that. And I really hope that all of you who are listening will take a look at this book and order it, because I think what Felipe is doing is he's cracking open part of the Latino soul that I don't think we were taught. It's definitely not part of the history that we were told about ourselves. So this is an opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about how religion has influenced who we are and where, when we had our movements in history, where did those come from? What was the fire behind that? I am just thrilled to know that it was that church,
Yeah.
you know, and that type of thinking. So I'm really excited about that. Daniel, what do you want to, what topic do you want to end with?
I want to end with the loyalty to culture topic. I really think getting Felipe's sense on the loyalty to culture would be a fascinating topic. You know, when we think about learning our history and learning, you know, what we just talked about, so much is important about our culture, and we struggle every day. Michelle, you and I have done so many episodes about struggling through the Latino culture, whether it's professionally or how to get promoted or all of these different topics. You know, I guess I'd ask Felipe in terms of loyalty to culture, how has that played a role to you both as a professional and as a scholar, and then as a Latino man, as a gentleman, right? How has your culture influenced you, and how have you struggled with the loyalty to the culture and yet been rewarded with it at the same time?
That's an interesting question. I think in academia, and especially when you start at a place like Texas A&M, there's a sense that you have to prove that what you're doing is professional history, that what you're doing is a level of academic work that matters not just to your community, but to the broader American public and even to people around the world. And that's been a challenge. I think that's always been a very difficult thing. And I think especially when you come from the backgrounds that I know that we all come from, you know, those of us on here right now, it's this sense of when you enter academia and this kind of professional setting, it don't matter how woke you are or how much you think you have it together, you're still sort of worried, like, can I say this? Should I say this? Am I going to do this?
All the time.
Yeah. Can you?
All the time. How honest can I be?
Exactly. And you know that people are watching you. You know that people are going to judge you one way or another. It's taken me, frankly, a long time to get to a point of comfort and level, you know, where you start to feel comfortable in your own skin.
Right.
The loyalty to the culture has never been an issue for me. That's just something I've always carried with me, and my political commitments and my kind of sense of who I was. When I interviewed for the A&M job, they knew exactly what they were getting. I wasn't, you know, it wasn't something that I ever imagined getting. So when I interviewed for A&M, I was like, well, I'm not going to get this job, so I might as well just order the steak and have a good time, you know? And you know, because my thinking was, I'm going to work in the Valley, I'm going to teach, you know, and barbecue every weekend and go to high school football games and have a, you know, organize students and help them understand their culture and do that thing.
Yeah. And you're doing all that, but you're at A&M.
I'm doing all that now, but at A&M, but that wasn't easy. That took, you know, it's 11 years. If you run into me in 2010, 2011, it's
really?
I'm a deer in the headlights back then, because I'm trying to figure this whole thing out. Publishing, academia, tenure, what is this? Completely foreign to me. I was lucky in the sense that I had some really great mentors and people that looked out for me. And so I think mentorship is really important.
Yes.
In all of that. So I got very lucky on that front.
Yeah.
And the other part too with tenure is I started to see tenure and the publishing part of it, not as this sort of chore that I had to do,
right?
And as this idea, as this story that was honking outside of my house saying, you better tell this, even if you don't get tenure, it doesn't matter. You better write this book, because there's no, even if you write the book, there's no guarantee. So
right.
For me, it was like, I got to get this story out, because if I don't do it, nobody else is going to do it.
I really like the idea that you are a champion for the culture. And I was thinking as you were talking about, you know, how do we reach out to those Latinos in higher education who are not completing? You know, that's a constant battle. It's something that we talk about in community colleges every single day. How do we reach out to them so that they can understand that the idea that they can be true to who they are, the way that you have been, and still living the ideals that they had in their mind of when they were going to grow up and still get to take their kids to football games and still get to barbecue with the family, to have the best of both worlds. Because what I really appreciate about your position is it was through your culture that you gained access. It was because of your culture, that you have become the well-known scholar that you are, and that you've turned what is historically seen as the chore of publishing into a life story, right, of sorts. And one of the conversations we had, I think just yesterday, in our Pathways team, Texas Pathways, was, we take our students through the idea of, in higher education, we're like completion, right? Completion. Okay, so completion means a couple of things. It means an associate's degree and it means a bachelor's. I'm tired of that definition. Mm-hmm. I want to see more Latinos like you and Daniel. And we have to start talking about that much earlier than we do. It seems like we just have this, the door narrows or the pathway narrows. It's this funnel, and only certain Latinos can go teach at a community college or be a professor at A&M. And we know that's not true. Yeah. I mean, we know brilliant people, we know dynamic people. So I like the idea that both you and Daniel are showing, intentionally through mentoring and also by example, what's possible. And you're doing it in a very fun way. I mean, I think I can see how publishing could be fun if you're telling.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it's work, and you all know that it's work. It's struggle, and there's no, and even with mentoring students, it's often work that you're wondering. I'm going out. When I used to go to campus and talk to students, now it's all Zoom, but
right.
I'd be leaving the house to go do a lecture for a student group at 9:00 at night on campus, and I'm like, what am I doing? But when you're there, you're like, this is exactly why I'm here, because that care and that empathy and being able to listen to your students.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how brilliant you are. If you don't care about their lives and their livelihoods and where they're coming from, it's not going to mean a thing.
And shouldn't there be that? In higher education.
I saw somewhere on A&M, I'm an Aggie and I follow A&M's website, the LatinX graduation ceremony. And that was very powerful. Michelle, I don't know if you saw that, but it was, Felipe was in the middle of it all. And it made me proud to see a Latino who had to have been up there either on the weekend or the evening, because it's not 2:00 on a Tuesday because all the families are there, right? But it was a Latinx graduation where there were puro Latinos, and they were doing graduations with their grandma, and it got me emotional because we go through that moment of our graduation and seeing our grandparents and our parents and knowing what had happened. So there are so many more examples that you're giving back and representing the culture in your everyday work there at Texas A&M. And
it's a way of thinking about, you get to a position because other people, pulled me by the ear, grabbed me and said, hey, vente pa acá. No, vente pa acá, vente pa acá. You know what I mean? It's that like, quédate aquí quédate. Yep. This is where you're going, exactly. Right? And there's a responsibility when you get to this position, and it's hard. It's not easy. I don't mean to romanticize it in any way. You all know this better than anybody.
Sure.
It's a way to be able to say thank you to all the people that helped me get to where I got to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in closing, we'll wrap this up. I know we've been on a long time, and we could go hours.
So much fun. This has been a lot of fun, though. It hasn't felt like, it's already, it's crazy.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's like I'm sitting in the back with all my primos laughing, and I just need somebody to poke fun of, somebody to break their balls. Who are we going to talk about, right? But it's been the subject of Latino, so we'll keep doing that. But in closing, we want to get kind of your final thoughts about Latinos, and really when we talk about the direction of where we're going. We've talked about education, we've talked about the election. We talked a little bit about generational differences, culture, COVID-19, all of those things. Where is the Latinx community, 10 years from now? Where are we going to fall short, and where are we going to exceed in areas? And what's the hope for all of our Latinx professionals in higher education and students? And what's our charge moving forward? I mean, we want to hear it from you. We want to know what you think.
I think we've got some monumental challenges ahead of us. We don't have enough, even though the numbers of students graduating from our institutions are going up, we still don't have enough students in higher ed. We still don't have enough students that are going to graduate school. And we still don't have enough students that are moving in the direction of being administrators in higher ed, or even getting to the kinds of positions in business or in pharmaceuticals or in healthcare, or in the media, like we talked about earlier. I think those numbers are changing, but the monumental challenge is going to be, as the demographics continue to rise, you could still have an elite number of folks that are non-Latino that are making decisions on behalf of our community.
Yeah.
That's central to me. That worries me. I think about that a lot. I find hope in the students that are going to law school and they're doing really great work. And there's a lot of us that are, but there's not enough. And I think that remains for me it's an education challenge, this monumental educational challenge that we still have. The other challenge is our narrative, our story for the American public, in terms of, the kind of amazing work that we've been doing and writing for a long time. Another Brownsville native, Americo Paredes, who,
amazing.
You see what I mean? Like, that publishing has been there. Writing and telling these stories and narratives has been there for a long time. And we still continue to be marginalized and pushed aside. And I wonder what it's going to take for us to not just have a seat at the table, but for us to actually, have a conversation, to be a part of this narrative of what it means to be an American, because I think we're continually pushing up against that. And I hate that we continue to be left out of that larger, conversation. That's the other part that worries me. I think in terms of making sure we get more curriculum relevant, cultural curriculum that's culturally relevant for our students in high school. I like the fact that at least in Texas, there is a Mexican American Studies program that a lot of people fought very, very hard for to get. So all of these things that are beginning to sort of happen, and yet we still have to ramp it up. We still have a ton of work that we need to do. And I think every day, I used to do anti-racism training and education for a nonprofit agency many moons ago. And one of the things that we used to talk about was that, we used to use the metaphor of an iceberg to talk about racism. And we used to say that, if racism is that iceberg, then the sea around it is the sea of resistance. It's the sea of people that have continually fought to break down that iceberg.
I love that.
And to tear it down. And I think about every single day when we get up, and nowadays when we're on a Zoom chat, or when we go to work, or when we represent and we're there for our people, we are part of that daily sea of resistance where we make our mark. It might not be huge and we might think we're not doing enough, but we're chipping away at that legacy of white supremacy every single day. And I'm a big believer in that kind of hopeful way of thinking. Robin Kelly, the historian, calls it freedom dreams. It's a way that people imagine and dream about freedom in their lives, even if it might seem far off, even if it might seem not realistic. It's the imagination, and it's it's the radicals within us that begin to imagine a different world and something new that can eventually take us there. And so thinking about that sea of resistance and every single day is what gives me the hope that we can fill that educational gap, that we can tell our story, that we can do the things that we're going to tell or that we're going to do. However long it takes, we're here. We're in the fight. We're fighting every day. We're not going anywhere. We just ain't going anywhere. Like, we're here.
In fact, we're multiplying.
Exactly. We're having a lot of babies.
I think your next book, Felipe, I think you found the title for your next book, Sea of Resistance. I've never heard anyone romanticize for me the word radicalism. I mean, that is a different take on it. It is an empowering, heartfelt, genuine grassroots feeling that you just inspired, that takes away from the rhetoric that you hear about being what it means to be radical. You say it in a way that is loyal and thoughtful and intentional and genuine, and I really like that. So I like that this is how we're ending. I feel very hopeful as well. We always end with a grito to someone in our community. Daniel, we didn't get to talk about this. I have someone. Have you thought of anybody?
No, I don't. Dan, a soul that's done anything good in my life, and a lot. I'm kidding. Go ahead. No, you go ahead and throw out the
So
grito.
Daniel, we always do a grito at the end for someone who's inspired us or someone who we think really deserves the recognition. And so if you think of someone that you want to recognize, please feel free to share. But I met someone today on a call with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We were being interviewed by them, and I was on the call with Alamo College and with Dallas College, and her name was Priscilla Gamacho, I believe. And she's with Alamo College, and I think she works in their judicial affairs department, and she's an attorney. And she just blew me away with her knowledge of the way that the college worked. She just, you find one of those people and you're like, that is a mentor. I want to learn from them. It's how I felt about Daniel when I first met him. But I just wanted to give a shout out to her because she inspired me with the way that she was able to capture what it is that we're doing in community colleges and explain it so succinctly to, such a big organization that hopefully is going to throw a lot of money at us one day to help us with our completion efforts. So Priscilla Camacho from Alamo Colleges. Do you have anybody that you'd like to recognize, Felipe?
Oh man, I have, what can I tell you? I have a ton of people that I could think of. I often, and let me just sort of say in a general sense that I am, like you, continually impressed and inspired by colleagues who are doing just fantastic work, and people that can take ideas that are difficult or moments that are difficult, like the one we're living in now, and find a way to help us at least dream through or think through what is possible. In graduate school, we talked about the politics of the possible. And I think of my grandparents every time. I mean, when I give a talk, in front of an academic audience, and I'm extremely intimidated, as I often am, I write the names of my grandparents, Joaquin, Dominga, Manuela, and Felix. And I write it on the top of my paper because I think, if I mess up today, it's gonna be fine. As long as I don't embarrass these 4 people today, I know that they're proud of me no matter what happens. If these people hate me today or whatever it is. And that gives me inspiration every single day, because I cannot imagine the horrors of migrating or immigrating to this country like my paternal grandparents did. I cannot imagine the horrors of wondering what it is you're going to eat the next day, what life will be like. And that's where I draw my inspiration from daily, actually.
I have never wanted to cry during a grito, but that's where I
There's
am.
been 2 times I've been wanting to cry now during this thing. It's been twice already because I'm a very emotional guy. So
no, it got me. It brought me a tear because it's you think about all the sacrifices and all the hard work of our grandparents and our great grandparents, and where we certainly wouldn't be if it wasn't for them. And so there's a lot that we owe to the generations that come before us, and hopefully we will make proud the generations that come after us. Hopefully they'll watch this 20 years from now and ask, Juthu, what is that? That's time of way back to the future, or way back to the time zone. I do have, Michelle, a grito that I want to give out to Mario Castillo. He is the interim president.
Yeah.
He's a genius. He's an attorney by trade, but he is newly appointed interim president at Lone Star College, Kingwood. And he is the only and first Hispanic president within the Lone Star College system. They've got 6 individual campuses now and have been around for 35 years, and majority Hispanic. So it's a big thing in Houston for us to have a community college president that looks like us, that sounds like us, that thinks like us. And so, I think
he taught in Brownsville.
He's a great guy, dear friend of mine. And so I just want to give a shout out to Mario Castillo. We're very, very proud of him and hope he does extremely well at Lone Star College, Kingwood.
I did. How did I miss that? I missed it. Congratulations, Mario. That is just amazing.
Yeah, you got to read the Houston Chronicle. That's where I read it.
That's where I read the Chronicle. I'm so proud of him. That's wonderful. Well, y'all, we hope that you got something from today. We know we did. So even if you didn't, we don't really care because this was great for us. And we're leaving here inspired and empowered and more connected to who we are, I think, than we were when we started the evening. So Felipe, thank you for being only our second interview guest. We hope to continue these conversations and hopefully have you back after your book is released, because we want to read it and we'd like to follow up on that. It has been a pleasure getting to know you, and we hope that you will continue the good work that you're doing and continue to make us proud.
Well, thank you both, Michelle and Danielle. Just you both are so gracious and so kind, and great questions and very professional. And so I can't believe we've been talking for as long as we've been talking, because it's felt like home. What else can I say? It's felt like home. So thank you both.
You're very welcome.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you on the next week's episode.